The pursuit of absolute truth has a documented historical habit of leaving its seekers completely broke. A recently penned Urdu poem titled Intizar is Sagar by Mustafa Sajjad Haider captures this exact devastating collision between mystical ambition and economic survival in just 4 lines. The poem takes us from the legendary romance of Layla and Majnun to the dense metaphysics of the Andalusian scholar Ibn Arabi, only to crash land into the mundane anxiety of paying the bills. It is a striking piece of contemporary literature because it dissects a very specific cultural tragedy, the romanticization of the starving artist, or, in the South Asian context, the ascetic dervish, and asks whether abandoning the material world was actually a profound spiritual victory or just a massive self-inflicted mistake.
That tension is the beating heart of the poem. The title itself, Intizar Sagar, translates roughly to waiting for the goblet, which immediately invokes classical Sufi imagery. In traditional Persian and Urdu poetry, the goblet or wine is a metaphor for divine knowledge or spiritual ecstasy, but Haider flips that classical expectation on its head. He opens by mapping out the ultimate spectrum of esoteric pursuit, writing, "From Layla Majnun to Ibn Arabi, we kept searching for truth." He sets you up to expect a glorious spiritual awakening, but the poem turns into a bitter confession about the cost of that search.
Let us unpack that first boundary he draws, from Layla and Majnun to Ibn Arabi. These are 2 vastly different models of seeking truth. Layla and Majnun represent the emotional, almost manic path. Literary historians note that the 12th century poet Nizami Ganjavi popularized their story not just as a tragic romance, but as an allegory. Majnun literally translates to possessed or mad. His love for Layla becomes so intense that he loses his mind, abandons civilization, and wanders the desert. He strips away his ego completely until he cannot tell where he ends and she begins.
Right. Majnun is the archetype of reaching truth through absolute annihilation of the self, what Sufi scholars call fana. On the other end of Haider's spectrum is Ibn Arabi. If Majnun is the emotional extreme, Ibn Arabi, the 13th century philosopher, is the supreme intellectual extreme. Academic consensus surrounding Islamic mysticism regards Ibn Arabi as the architect of Wahdat al-Wujud, or the unity of being. His philosophy posits that there is only one true reality, one existence, and everything in the material world is just a reflection or a shadow of the divine. So, Haider is saying, we tried it all. We tried the maddening, all-consuming passion of Majnun, and we tried the towering, complex metaphysics of Ibn Arabi.
Which makes the second line of the poem hit with incredible force. After establishing this grand, cosmic search for truth, the poet writes, forgetting tales and stories and worrying about making a living. The Urdu phrase fikr-e-mash translates to the anxiety of livelihood, the daily grind. It completely punctures the mystical balloon. I find it fascinating how the poem suggests that the search for ultimate truth actually became a distraction from basic survival, or perhaps the demands of basic survival made those grand spiritual stories feel like useless fairy tales.
It is a brutal juxtaposition. You cannot philosophize on the unity of being when you're starving. The poet acknowledges that they forgot the Kise-Kahanian, the legends and fables of spiritual giants, because the sheer gravity of fikr-e-mash pulled them back down to earth. Scholars of modern South Asian literature often point out that contemporary poetry has heavily pivoted toward economic realism. Classical poetry could afford to linger in the gardens and taverns of the mind, but modern poetry is inextricably tied to the anxieties of late-stage capitalism. Haider is expressing a generational disillusionment. The pursuit of higher truth does not put food on the table.
But is he simply saying that the rent is due, so philosophy must take a back seat? Because the third line introduces a deeply psychological element. Others' worlds became heaven. We stole our glances away from it. There is a palpable sense of alienation here. While the speaker was busy emulating Ibn Arabi and Majnun, the rest of the world moved on. They built their earthly paradises, accumulated wealth, found stability. The speaker cannot even bear to look at this material success. They avert their eyes. It implies a mixture of pride, shame, and profound isolation.
That averted glance is crucial. It is the defensive posture of the intellectual or the artist who realizes they have lost the game of worldly success. They tell themselves they are above material wealth, that the heaven others have built is shallow. But averting the eyes betrays a sense of longing, or at least a painful awareness of the disparity. Sociological analyses of ascetic communities, whether they are monks in a monastery or wandering dervishes, frequently highlight this tension. The ascetic rejects the world, but the world's continued, glittering existence constantly tests that rejection. Haider captures the moment the ascetic realizes their spiritual superiority might actually just be an excuse for their material failure.
That brings us to the devastating final line. Becoming dervishes and fakirs, we kept ruining our own world. He uses the words malung and fakir. Historically, in the Indian subcontinent, a malung is an unorthodox, wandering mystic, often unkempt, who defies social norms. A fakir is an ascetic who has taken a vow of poverty, surrendering everything to God. For centuries, these figures have been revered in regional folklore as saints who possess hidden wisdom, but Haider strips away that reverence entirely.
He absolutely guts the romanticized image of the malung. The word he uses at the end is khalas, which has a fascinating dual meaning in Urdu and Arabic. It can mean finished, ruined, or destroyed, but it can also mean liberated or absolved. In the context of the poem, it leans heavily toward ruin. By adopting the persona of the wandering mystic, by pretending to be above the fray of fikr-e-mash, the speaker admits they systematically dismantled their own life. It is a stunning indictment of spiritual escapism. They did not achieve enlightenment, they just became destitute.
It almost reads like an autopsy of an intellectual generation. We see this archetype everywhere, not just in South Asia. Think of the starving artist in Montmartre or the beatnik poet in Greenwich Village. There is a universal narrative that suffering and poverty are prerequisites for profound insight. Haider's poem seems to ask, what if that is a lie we tell ourselves to justify our inability to cope with reality? What if becoming a fakir isn't a noble sacrifice, but a catastrophic failure to engage with the world?
That is a piercing critique, and it aligns perfectly with the shift in modern literary theory. For a long time, the critical establishment celebrated texts that privileged the mind over the body, the spiritual over the material. But contemporary Marxist literary critiques argue that romanticizing poverty as a spiritual virtue is actually a mechanism of control. It keeps the marginalized placated. If you believe your poverty brings you closer to the truth of Ibn Arabi, you are less likely to demand fair wages or better living conditions. Haider's poem breaks that spell. The speaker realizes that while they were busy being spiritual purists, the others claimed all the tangible rewards of the earth.
I want to circle back to the title, Waiting for the Goblet. If the poem ends in this state of self-inflicted ruin, what exactly is the goblet they are still waiting for? Is it salvation? Is it a sudden stroke of luck? Or is the waiting itself the tragedy? The act of waiting implies passivity. A malung waits for divine grace. A worker demands a paycheck. By waiting for the goblet, they are trapped in a state of perpetual inaction.
The waiting is the paralysis. Literary analysts looking at existentialist themes and post-colonial literature often focus on this motif of waiting. You see it famously in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where the waiting replaces living. Haider is tapping into that same existential dread. The Saghar, the goblet, represents a promised relief that is never coming. They ruined their lives waiting for a mystical high or a philosophical breakthrough that proved entirely useless against the cold reality of economics. It is a profound demystification of the ascetic ideal.
It makes me wonder about the historical context that breeds this kind of realization. The poem is dated May 2026. We are looking at a period marked by intense global economic pressure, hyperinflation in many parts of the developing world, and a general sense of precariousness. In such times, philosophical abstraction feels like an unaffordable luxury. When a loaf of bread costs what it does, sitting under a tree pondering the unity of being starts to look less like wisdom and more like negligence.
Economic data from recent years supports that exact sentiment. Reports from global financial institutions over the last decade have highlighted how inflation disproportionately affects the middle and lower classes in South Asia, effectively wiping out the creative and intellectual breathing room that societies need to foster art and philosophy. When survival takes up 100% of your cognitive load, high-minded pursuits collapse. Haider is essentially documenting the death of the philosopher-poet under the crushing weight of modern economics. The Malang is no longer a revered mystic. He is just an unemployed person who cannot participate in the economy.
And yet, despite its heavy realism, the poem is incredibly beautiful. The rhythm, the internal rhymes, the evocation of centuries-old cultural touchstones like Laila and Majnun. Haider uses the very tools of classical poetry to dismantle the classical worldview. He builds a beautiful house just to show us the foundation is rotting. Is there any reading of this poem where the speaker retains some dignity, or is it purely a confession of defeat?
I would argue the dignity lies entirely in the honesty of the confession. A lesser poet would have maintained the facade. They would have written about how their poverty is a badge of honor, how their suffering makes them superior to those living in the worldly heaven. But Haider refuses to lie to his audience or to himself. Acknowledging that we kept ruining our own world requires a tremendous amount of intellectual courage. Psychologists studying cognitive dissonance point out how fiercely people will defend their life choices, especially when those choices have cost them dearly. To look back at a life dedicated to esoteric truth and admit it was a practical disaster is a brutal yet dignified reckoning.
That is a vital point. The clarity of the confession is its own form of truth. So, in a deeply ironic way, they did find the truth they set out searching for in the first line. It just wasn't the sweeping, divine truth of Ibn Arabi. It was the harsh, grounded truth of their own material reality. They spent a lifetime looking at the heavens, only to finally discover the ground beneath their feet right as it crumbled.
Exactly. The truth transitioned from the metaphysical to the empirical. And that transition is the core narrative of modernism. We move from mythos to logos, from divine inspiration to material analysis. Haider compresses that massive historical paradigm shift into 4 lines of Urdu verse. It is an incredibly dense, layered piece of work that speaks to anyone who has ever had to abandon a dream because it did not pay the rent.
It leaves us contemplating the delicate balance between nurturing the soul and sustaining the body. Mustafa Sajjad Haider's Intizar Sagar reminds us that while soaring through the abstract heights of philosophy might expand the mind, we cannot afford to lose sight of the earth, lest we wake up to find our own world dismantled. If this discussion sparked something for you, send this episode to someone who appreciates the intersection of poetry, philosophy, and the harsh realities of modern life.